Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture, Albion Never Dies. And today with me again is Caine, joining me all the way in Fuzhou, right? All the way in Fuzhou, China.
Yeah, it's just the end of the morning here. It's almost lunchtime. I'm not exactly sure I'd call it a lovely summer's day. I suppose it depends on your opinion. I'm just checking how hot it is today. 35 degrees is the temperature today, according to my weather app on my phone. And then on top of that, we have all the humidity of stuff, all the humidity which increases the heat. But yeah, I'm here from Fuzhou, and you, of course, Tom, are in California, right?
That's right, yes. I'm down in Southern California, where again it's pretty warm by English standards, but it's not so humid, obviously, as in China before, where it was very, very, very humid. So just that lessening of humidity, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good. And already, even though we're living abroad I'm in the US, you're in China, we're already talking about the weather. What could be more British?
As soon as I said it, I thought, oh God, now I'm becoming a stereotype, you know?
But it is worth talking about. I mean, some people used to ask me, why do Brits always talk about the weather? And it's simply that in England it changes a lot, right, day to day, within the day.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just it's just small talk, isn't it? It's just a conversation starter. There's not much to it. It's not as if anybody's trying to answer any great, existential questions. It's just a way to start a conversation with.
But I mean, when I was in Saudi Arabia, if you'd ask somebody, what's the weather like today, or how's the weather? I mean, same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. It's sunny.
Yeah, I mean, for example, here in China, the most common way to greet somebody is to ask them if they've eaten yet. Right. So again, it's just a way of starting a conversation. I don't think they really care that much if you've eaten. It's, a little bit like talking about the weather. It's just a way to get a conversation started.
Oh, I found one of the best ways to get a reaction is to say, well, butcherla.
Yeah.
No, I'm hungry.
Well,
I tried amping it up. But already we're getting stuck into those differences. Today, we're really talking about the experience of being British, but not in Britain, of living abroad.
Yeah, so we're going to be chatting about what it's like to be a British expat and how it sort of affects your experience and understanding of British culture, because it's something that you and I have, quite a reasonable amount of experience. You, of course, more so than me.
But you do have quite a lot of experience, especially living in China, right?
Yeah, well, perhaps we can begin just to give your audience some context so they can understand where we're coming from, give them a little bit of an overview of our kind of, what would you call it, expat history, I suppose. So I was born and schooled and raised in the UK and spent most of my life there. In my early 20s, I began traveling quite a lot, traveled pretty extensively. But of course, traveling is not the same as living abroad. I did work abroad in a couple of different places. I spent a good few months in Barcelona in Spain, where I studied Spanish in a language school, and I also did a bit of work for some nightclubs there. And then later in my mid-20s, I worked for a summer in Canada, in a little town in southern Ontario. I was a waiter. So, I already had sort of spent quite a bit of time traveling and had a little bit of experience of working outside the UK, but I wouldn't really consider any of that a kind of, at least in my opinion, an expat experience, because, visiting a country is not the same as living there. And those times I spent working abroad, they were really more working holidays or studying holidays than they were, sort of ordinary life, let's call it. So my one and so far only expat experience is I moved to China 9 years ago. So I've been living and working continuously in China for the past 9 years, and I'm still here. So that's my expat experience. I'm a British person living in China for going on a decade.
That's a decade in a very unusual country to live in. And it's not like there's a huge English community where you're living, is there?
No, I mean, well, I don't think there's a huge English community in China, full stop. In fact, as a percentage of China's population, the number of non-Chinese people in the country is almost negligible. Yeah. But of course, almost all of the foreigners are concentrated in certain cities, right? So Shenzhen, Beijing, Shanghai, and so on. In the city where I live, which is Fuzhou, there aren't many non-Chinese people, and of the non-Chinese people that are here, I couldn't tell you, of course, how many Brits there are, but I've met very few. I think I haven't lived entirely in Fuzhou the whole time. I've lived in Fuzhou for 8 years, and in the 8 years I've lived in Fuzhou, I think I've met probably, 5 British people. I'm sure there are more. Of course, there are more. but yeah, I've only met about 5 of them. So I'm not exactly part of a British expat community, let's say that, or I'm the community of one, perhaps. But I think, Tom, your expat history is more diverse and perhaps more interesting than mine. So perhaps you can fill your listeners in on that.
Sure. So, I mean, my first time living abroad was actually with my parents living in Germany when I was a baby. So my father was in the army and was posted to Berlin. So my earliest memories, I guess, must be in Berlin. But I moved back to the UK again, relatively young, and had all my primary school after kindergarten was in the UK. Some of my secondary school, but at 16, I moved to the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is unrecognized state.
Yeah, well, partially recognized, I suppose, right? There's a couple of places that recognize it, right?
Turkey recognizes them, and there's a few Central Asian countries that occasionally talk about recognizing them.
Right.
Most people haven't heard of it, which I think is completely fair. I think in the UN, there's 198 countries. I'd be hard pressed to name all of them, the majority of them. And this is not a recognized country. So there's a collection
fair enough.
Around the world. So as I say, it's a very small place, quite sleepy, and pretty isolated, to be frank. When I first went there, I would describe it as very, very isolated, almost a Cuba of the Mediterranean. But very, very beautiful. And the expat community was about 200. So 200 Brits.
Oh, so not a great deal. In my mind, I imagined it to be a bit more.
I think if I'd gone to what most people think of as Cyprus, which is Greek Cyprus in the south, there would have been a significant population. But when I first went,
it's a popular holiday destination for Brits, actually, Cyprus, right?
Yes. And there's 2 sovereign bases there. So again, there's like a resident military population there, and a lot of like military people, if they go there, like it and want to retire there, which is kind of my family routine. My family had been there in the 50s, liked it, and again, just moved. My father moved there, I'd say, when I was 16.
So just to clarify, you weren't born in Germany. You were born in the UK, but very, very early you spent some time in Germany.
That's right. So almost the first thing after I was born, as soon as I was able to travel, I was taken to Germany.
Okay.
Yes. So
that was just a few years, and then back to the UK where you did primary school and part of your secondary school.
That's right. Yeah.
And then off to Turkish Cyprus at about 16.
Yeah. And then just 7 years lived there, which is kind of a formative time. Yeah. And
then where was after Turkish Cyprus then?
So after that, I went to university. I went to university as a mature student. So I worked in Bradford for a time, but then I got a job in Saudi Arabia for 6 months.
So, sorry, just 1 second, just to quickly go back to it. So you went to university in the UK?
Yes, I did. Yes. Yeah.
So 7 years in Turkish Cyprus, and then what would have that been? 4 years in the UK?
That's correct. 4 years.
Okay. And so at this point, I'm trying to think. Have you spent more time inside or outside the UK?
I think it was approaching 50-50 at that point. But I'd spent, because of my childhood, slightly more time in the UK, I think.
Right. So even as a sort of relative, unlike me, I spent the majority of my life, right, until I was in my late 20s before becoming an expat. Even by the time you were in your sort of early 20s, you had almost spent as much time outside the UK as you had inside the UK.
Yeah, and certainly if we're going off my, my clear recollection, a very substantial
the most formative years were spent outside the UK. Okay, so then following that 4-year stint in the UK, you then left again.
That's right. Yeah, I was interested in traveling a bit more, and well, I applied for hundreds of jobs in China and one job in the Middle East, and I ended up getting that one job in the Middle East. Okay. I taught English to the most conservative clerics in Saudi Arabia, and I was living in it was very, very interesting. As I say, it's not my role to tell them what they should say. It's just that they can say what they want to say in better English.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Well, that's what they say, right? A good teacher doesn't teach you what to think; he teaches you how to think. So I suppose a good English teacher doesn't teach you what to say; he teaches you how to say it.
Exactly. So no matter what they were saying it in very good English. Yeah. Perhaps not culturally appropriate at all times, but very, very clearly said.
So how long was that then in the Middle East? And it was more than one country, right?
Yeah, so I spent 6 months in Saudi, and that was an unusual experience because it was not just teaching the professors. It was also an all-Arab company and living in an all-Arab area.
Right.
So I didn't really have a community to talk to.
Yeah.
But then I moved to Oman and spent 6 months there, again working. But this time, well, my parents were there. Partly
Oh,
why
they were okay.
yeah, they'd moved over there. They spent 6 years in Oman. I just spent 6 months. So it's a country I was familiar with because I'd already visited them quite a few times, and I really do love it.
And then is that the last from there you went to China?
1 year in the UK doing a master's, and
Okay.
then to China.
Right. Okay. So and then some of your listeners might be more familiar with that period, right? But just
Yeah,
to quantify it, what it was like 5 years, right, in China.
6 years now. Yeah, six
6 years.
years in total.
Okay.
Yeah,
And now?
and now I'm in California,
Okay. So
so I am bouncing around.
so we can I'm not going to do the maths, but I think we'd be fair of saying in total about 2/3 of your life outside the UK and almost all of your adult life outside the UK. Is that right?
Yes, yes, that's right. And my
Okay.
mind's wheeling at that thought, but yes.
Yeah, and so I mean that's a great way in I think to this topic because it's one thing to be like me, a British expat who's lived for a long period abroad, but nevertheless, most of my life has been spent in the UK. Whereas, you've spent less time in the UK than you've spent outside of it. And
Yeah.
like you pointed out, your most formative years have been spent outside the UK. So I think that must give you an interesting perspective on the culture. Maybe we can go back to the sort of first experience for you then, which
Sure.
was moving to Turkish Cyprus. So what I'm interested to know about that is, from the position of being an expat, right, for being a Brit outside of the UK, what was the community like there? You said it was small; it was only about 200 people.
Mm.
Are we talking of 200 people who are like deeply integrated into the local community and they're, most of the time speaking the local language and so on and so forth? Or are we talking at the other extreme, something like, I don't want to use the word ghettoized, but it's the only one that comes to my head, like a little ghettoized community of Brits who keep themselves to themselves, something in between. Like, what was the expat community
Mm.
like?
So the expat community, first of all, the age is worth mentioning. They were all very, very old. I mean, there were a large number of people in their 90s or
Okay.
100. So a lot of
Yeah.
them were kind of ex-colonial officials. They'd gone out to Africa or India in their youth, had spent a lot of their life there, and had very happy memories of Cyprus because it's the last place you can get really fresh produce before you go to Egypt by steamer ship and carry on through drier countries. So they
Mm.
had a happy memory, and this was kind of their last stop, well, in many ways.
Yeah.
So they retired there. And one of the interesting things is they'd spent their whole life as English people dealing with other cultures,
Right.
respectfully, as far as I could see, and learning languages and learning huge amounts about the countries they'd lived in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They're definitely not what many people would stereotypically think of as a British expat community. When a lot of people think about British expat communities, their mind jumps straight away to places like Marbella, for example, in Spain. And that community is often stereotyped, and like all stereotypes, I'm sure there's truth to it. It's stereotyped as being sort of ghettoized, right? As in everyone speaks only English. All of the bars and restaurants have English menus serving English food, and so on and so forth. Whereas this community was almost the polar opposite of that, where they've really gone out of their way to integrate and learn about the local culture or local
Yes, and
cultures.
one of the best, you're right about cultures. There are multiple ones in Cyprus. Turks and Greeks isn't just the end of it, there's more. But yeah, one of the really interesting old guys, taught me a huge amount, and many people a huge amount about Turkish Cypriot history by studying the castles, by interviewing people locally, by doing a huge amount of research, and then doing these gorgeous paintings, which even the local government would buy to display in museums. And so you'd learn about the evolution of for example, there's a castle on top of a mountain. It's thought to be the inspiration for the castle in Snow White. Um,
Really? Okay.
yeah, and it's been wonderful the way people have built this originally a fortification, and then of course over time it turns into a palace and so on and so on. But he would do these beautiful artworks showing the evolution of it over time and what different empires and rulers over time added. And as I say, they're bought by their local government because he, as a British expat, was studying the local culture and just explaining it so,
Yeah.
so well.
Well, that's one of the things about kind of being an outsider, isn't it? And of course,
Mm.
expats are in this strange position of being both insider and outsider at the same time. Is that being an outsider gives you a different perspective, which it isn't necessarily possible for those inside to get, right? And often that perspective can be enlightening because people haven't considered it before. Just one thing I actually wanted to ask: how come these people chose to settle in the Turkish part of Cyprus and not the other part?
Quite frankly, it's hard to go into that without getting very political. There has been a long conflict between the Turks and the Greeks, and many of them moved there as a political act because they believed passionately that Turkish Cypriots, in particular, had been very poorly treated by the international community, by the British government specifically, by the local government back in the 60s. So it was often a very personal statement.
Wow, okay.
Moving there.
I really didn't know that, and that's extremely interesting. That because it would have in many ways been easier for them to have gone to the other side of the island, right? I mean, living in a unrecognized state comes with a lot of problems, right? Especially things like traveling and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to, kind of, I suppose, is evidence of how well they have integrated or tried to integrate with the local community, that they were willing to sort of make self-sacrifices in order to support the local community's political goals.
Absolutely. And I found it fascinating how deep their knowledge was.
So taking it back then to the British cultural aspect. So we know that this community in Turkish Cyprus, they're obviously very well integrated into the local community, but they are still Brits, of course. Did they do certain things to try to preserve their British culture? Did they make a big deal out of certain celebrations, or set up, I don't know, local restaurants selling British food or something like this? Like, was there an attempt by the community to keep an aspect or aspects of Britishness alive, or were they happy just to sort of do away with it and be, try and be like the locals, I suppose?
I would say, best way I could describe it is quite Kipling-esque, in that there's a meeting of the two cultures, right? They were Brits, born and raised, and they would always be British, but they'd thoroughly enjoy some local aspects of culture. If I think of what preserved Britishness, it would probably be things like our attention to the post office, the British church, animal rescue societies, and like a local library and bookshop that supported the animal rescue charity.
Okay, so it was, and that's, that in and of itself is quite a British thing, right? These civic organizations and small sort of community action, but it wasn't necessarily dedicated to or aimed towards British culture. It might have been a display of British like characteristics, but it wasn't that they were trying, they didn't have a sort of, I don't know, British Day or something like that.
No. And Turkish Cypriots fully took part. They attended our church if they were Christian, and certainly took part in our animal rescue. It couldn't have been run without them.
Okay. I mean, were there cultural activities that are common in the UK that didn't happen? So I'm trying to think of an example.
Oh, yes, I can think of.
It's not a good example, but for example, Christmas, right? I'm sure Christmas was celebrated on the island, but that would be an example of something which is common in the UK, which, potentially might not be common elsewhere. So were there lots of things like that, like British cultural activities that didn't take place in the community on the island?
Well, Christmas took place. One thing that didn't happen, wasn't talked about, and slightly cycled out of my mind was Bonfire Night.
Okay, that's interesting.
So I remember going back to the UK and ended up. There was one random night I was asked to do a job in Hull, so I happily signed up for it without thinking about it. And as I went along on the bus, this is now when I'm older and I've left Turkish Cyprus. As I went along, I saw all of the fireworks and all of the bonfires going through Yorkshire, the roads raised up. And it was an extraordinary sight. There were hills you went over and you just saw hundreds and hundreds of bonfires. And I had completely forgotten about it. Again, there was just no reference to it. It wasn't something we did locally, probably just for fire risk, but it just wasn't something we did. So it was amazing to rediscover it.
That is interesting. And I'm wondering why that wasn't something they would continue. Particularly because, if you think about the significance of Bonfire Night, of course, it's a celebration of, sort of Protestant parliamentarianism, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
And by the sounds of it, the kind of people who made up the majority of this expat community would have been people who would have identified with that sort of, what would you call it? That kind of heritage, right? So why do you think it fell out of favor with the local expat community?
I'm wondering if it's just that you need a certain number of young people to organize a bonfire.
To build the bonfire, I suppose. Yeah, that could be it.
There's the fire risk, and there's a thing of taking the guy and taking it round, which we probably wouldn't do that to take around a guy around a village. I say we wouldn't bother the Turkish Cypriots with our own funny customs too much.
I just thought, actually, some of your listeners, particularly if there's some perhaps if there are some people listening in Asia or even North America, might not be familiar. So just a quick one. Bonfire Night is celebrated on the 5th of November, and it marks the time when Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament. They wanted to kill the Protestant ruling elite and the sort of pseudo-representative parliament that existed in the time, and replace that parliament with an absolute Catholic monarch. The plot was foiled, and to mark this event, every year on November the 5th, we have big bonfires, and we also have fireworks. In fact, another name for the day is Fireworks Night. That's what a lot of people call it. So yeah, it's a very popular celebration in the UK, but it is, as far as I can tell, it's pretty specific to the UK. It hasn't really traveled to the places which were colonized by the UK. I don't think there are many people in Australia, for example, who celebrate Bonfire Night. So just for your listeners who may not have been familiar with what Bonfire Night is. Yeah, that's an interesting one. In fact, I really miss Bonfire Night. I think Bonfire Night is I really like Bonfire Night. It's about the only celebration, and I'm going to sound like one of those, everything's so commercial these days. But Bonfire Night is about the only celebration I can think of that hasn't been commercialized, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's no Bonfire Night cards or Bonfire Night presents or anything like that.
And if there were, I'd set fire to them.
Yeah, set fire to them, yeah. It's just getting together with the local community, with your friends, and just enjoying some nice fireworks and a fire and having fun. I've never celebrated it in China. Now, part of me thinks I could relatively easily because I have access to almost weapons grade fireworks at a very affordable price, right? I could go to my local shop and buy incredible amounts of fireworks, which I couldn't do in the UK. So on the one hand, it would be quite easy for me to celebrate Bonfire Night because of the availability of the fireworks. On the other hand, where could I have a fire? I mean, for anybody who's not familiar with Chinese built environments, I mean, if you are anywhere except for in the countryside, you can't go to the local park and have a fire, right? And everywhere else is dominated by concrete and tower blocks. So what's more, like all of these kinds of events, I suppose, and this is something you face as an expat trying to keep a connection to your culture, they're inherently communal, right?
Yeah.
And I can't, even if I could, let's say, celebrate Bonfire Night by myself, well, it's kind of like, well, I'd be very much just going through the motions. It wouldn't have any significance because a celebration by its nature is communal. You need other people, friends, family, members of the community. And although I could ask Chinese friends, of course, because it would lack any significance to them, in turn, that would sort of take away the significance for me, right? So yeah, I've never celebrated Bonfire Night since I've been in China, and I do miss it. I've got some good memories of Bonfire Nights.
And I think you've hit on the reason, really, why perhaps we haven't celebrated it, right? So we mentioned Christmas. That's very much a family occasion, right? Easter is through the church. We have those organizations, but a bonfire night is really just your local town, your local village, and doing it somewhere removed from that would just seem strange.
Yeah, and I suppose it helps you to sort of realize as well how it's easy for these kind of traditions to be lost when people move away from their communities, right? Whether that's a person from Fuzhou, China, moving to the UK, or a British person moving to Fuzhou, you have to be very intentional about keeping up these cultural activities. They don't just happen. I mean, one thing I've discovered having lived in China is that Dr. Seuss was wrong. Christmas doesn't just come no matter what. You actually do have to do something to make it happen, right? Of course, in the Grinch tries to stop Christmas, but nevertheless, Christmas comes. But actually, you'll find that if you're in China, Christmas doesn't just come by itself. You need to be very intentional about celebrating Christmas. And, that's something I've had to try to do since I've been in China. And I have from the very first year here, I made a really big deal about trying to celebrate Christmas. The thing is, and I suppose this is evidence of how difficult it is to continue these kind of traditions, is that, for the last couple of years, I've barely celebrated Christmas. I mean, I've marked the occasion. I've taken the day off work. I've made some nice food and stuff like that, but I haven't really, I put a tree up, it's not like I've done nothing, but compared to say my first few years in China, where I really, really went all out, decorated my house very well. I would try and invite lots of people around. I'd watch lots of Christmas films, listen to lots of Christmas music to really try to get into the Christmas spirit. The last couple of years, I've almost been sort of defeated by the futility, right? Because you can't recreate, people talk about that feeling of Christmas. You can't recreate that feeling. That feeling is based upon there being hundreds, if not thousands of people in your local area who all share the same kind of ideas about the event and who believe the event signifies similar things, right? And it creates this intangible sort of, almost mystical type, I don't know what you call it, atmosphere, right? Feeling.
Yeah.
And you can recreate the symptoms of that. So you can recreate the decorations and the trees and the special food, but you can't recreate the causes of it. You can't recreate the culture and stuff. And yeah, like I said, for the last couple of years, I've just kind of almost conceded defeat. Been like, you know what, Christmas doesn't come to Fuzhou, so I'll stop trying to make it.
Well, it struck me a while ago when I was messaging one of my Muslim friends who mentioned, it's Eid right now, and it really hit me. It was like a year or two ago, but I was really stunned that I didn't know, because obviously a huge amount of my life have been surrounded by Muslim friends, and so for me it's just part of life's natural cycle. Eids. So I was really stunned. But again, it wasn't something I was conscious about. It was always just around me, and I always just knew.
Yeah, so when you left that community, it just ceased to be part of your life.
Exactly.
So from Turkish Cyprus, which is obviously a really interesting experience, right? Growing up as an expat, a Brit abroad, you then returned to the UK as a sort of young man, right? So already you're sort of pretty much done. You're kind of fully formed, right? Your most important experiences, many of your most important experiences have already happened, right? So what was that like then, going to the UK as a young man who's had most of his formative experiences in a place which is culturally very different from the UK? I mean, did you feel like an outsider? Did you feel like an insider? Were there sort of cultural shocks and things like that?
There were definitely significant cultural shocks. So for me, the biggest one was that generally English was the language inside the house, and then when I went out, I spoke Turkish. Whereas in Bradford, where I lived, obviously everyone's speaking English, and I found it really weird to suddenly be deprived of my second language.
Right.
So I ended up filling my room with all kinds of, Turkish music, Turkish TV shows, Turkish films, whatever. I suddenly flipped it round so that everything was the opposite. It was Turkish inside my room, and then it was English outside.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting as well that you, and I suppose this would be the difference in age, is that you actually were very intentional about keeping that sort of Turkish culture alive when you came to the UK, and it's in a sense, it's a little bit like how, because I'm a community of one in Fuzhou, whereas you went into an established expat community, right? So you didn't have to necessarily work so hard to keep the British culture alive. Now that you've gone to Bradford, where if there was a Turkish community, it would have been very small, and you didn't know where to find it, and as such, you had to be a lot more intentional about trying to keep that sort of culture alive.
Absolutely. So that was something I very much focused on, and still focus on now. So, for example, I traveled from China to California via Istanbul. Just happens to be the way the flights worked out. So I was delighted. I was zooming around the airport, picking up the latest Turkish novel that I want, and a few other little things. Dried apricots from Malatya.
It's interesting that it still continues to be with you. and shows how much you imbibed, the local culture, which again, going back to, whether or not British expat communities generally integrate. I mean, it certainly seems that, you're a product of an expat community in Turkish Cyprus, and which is very integrated, right?
Yeah, I really, really do think about the Rudyard Kipling books because, I mean, it ties into my family history. My family lived in India in the 19th century, but we're all very, very English.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So, you kind of come from an expat family. I keep saying the word expat, and it may not even be the most accurate word. I'm sure there are probably different words we could use to describe. You could certainly say immigrant. If your family were living permanently, have moved permanently outside the UK, and there are probably other words as well. But just for ease, I think we can keep saying expat because we both know what we mean, right?
I do find that interesting, the difference between what is an immigrant and what is an expat, right? So as an expat, it suggests that I don't intend to integrate, right? An immigrant, you kind of expect to take local nationality and local customs and become eventually a local. Say Arnold Schwarzenegger is not an Austrian expat, he is an immigrant to America.
Right. That's an interesting way of looking at it, actually. I haven't thought about it that way. Firstly, I think, to sort of lay my cards on the table, I think it's basically semantics. I think that, especially on the internet, people like to argue about things, right? And I think this is one of those things where some people like to argue about it for the sake of arguing about it. As far as I'm personally concerned, you want to call yourself an expat, an immigrant, that's entirely up to you. And I don't think it alters anything about your situation individually. I think that for the purposes of, say, what we're doing, it's important that we use a term, right, to let people know what we're talking about. For me personally, when I think of expat, and by no means am I saying that this is the only or even the correct definition, it's just the one that I personally think of. The difference, I think, between expat and immigrants is that immigrant implies that you've moved to live in a country permanently, not necessarily that you're going to integrate, because I think it's fair to say that some immigrants totally integrate and some immigrants don't, right? I think what it implies is that you've moved with the intention of living permanently in a place, whereas an expat is in a more temporary situation and they are living in the place until they, move back to their home country or move elsewhere. So, for example, the only reason that I don't refer to myself as an immigrant in China is because I don't intend to live here forever. Even though I've lived here for 9 years, I see myself going back to the UK. My stay here is temporary. What's more, there is no practical way for a non-Chinese person to live permanently in China. Whereas in the UK, you can get indefinite leave to remain, and then you can become a British citizen. Or in the US, for example, you can get a green card, and then if you want to become a citizen. In China, they don't have any process like that. If you live in China as a non-Chinese person, you will permanently be on 1 year renewable residence permits, which you have to renew. So there is no way to be a permanent resident of the country. Practically speaking, there are ways that exist in theory, but in practice, they don't really exist. So for me personally, I know that even if I wanted to live in China permanently, it's not possible for me. And what's more, I do intend at some point to move back to the UK. And for that reason, I refer to myself as an expat. If, let's say, I moved to Canada where I could get permanent residency, right, provided I met all the requirements, and I moved to Canada and I got permanent residency, I would call myself an immigrant. I would say that I emigrated to Canada because my intention would be to live there permanently. So that's my personal sort of definition of those two words, expat versus immigrant. But like I said, I genuinely think that it doesn't really matter which one you use as long as you define your meaning so that you can talk about it, right? Like if you mean something else by expat, that's fine. Just make it clear that's what you mean. If you mean something else by immigrant, if somebody else in China has lived in China, say a British person living in China for 9 years like me, wants to call themselves an immigrant, absolutely fine. No problem whatsoever, right? But for me personally, I that's the difference I see, right? So I would call myself an immigrant if I'd moved permanently to a different country and was planning to live there for the rest of my life. In the situation that I'm in now, that's not the case, and therefore I call myself an expat.
Fair enough. And I found it really interesting when I told American friends that I was moving to California, almost universally the question was, "Oh, you're going to become a citizen," which, to be honest, it couldn't be further from my mind. And I found it so interesting, maybe being so used to people who want to come to America and want to gain citizenship. But to my mind, I'm an expat by, I think, both our definitions, and that I'm here, for a bit. I don't know how
Yeah.
long that bit is. I wouldn't say I'm hugely intentional about the time frame now, but I'm here for a bit, and I see the UK as my home.
Yeah, okay, and that's what I mean when I say expat. Is it's that temporariness of it,
Mm,
the fact that you're not planning to live there forever, which to me personally makes the difference. And which is why when I said, for example, you come from a family of expats, because your family, some of them were born in
mm,
India, some of them lived in Malaysia, but at no point, as far as I know, right, were they planning to sort of become Malaysian citizens or live in India permanently
exactly.
and so on. Yeah, that's interesting. Then you said you still see the UK as your home.
Mm,
I find that very interesting, considering that you've lived outside the UK for so long, right? 2/3 of your life, almost all your adult life, most of your formative periods.
mm.
So it would be very easy for you to not think of the UK as your home, right?
Yes, yeah.
And
But I find it fairly common for specifically British expatriates to rarely refer to Britain as home. I have met people from other countries who'll say, "Oh, I'm not really from this country anymore. I'm a global citizen or whatever." But most Brits I know, although there are those who say it, will say, "I'm British," even if they've spent 20, 30, 40 years abroad. Um,
Yeah, that's interesting, right? And of course, because that is that's a choice. You could just as easily
mm,
say you were something else, right? You could just as easily say that you were wherever it was you were living. The global citizen thing is funny though. To be honest, personally, the
mm.
only people I've ever met who've said that they're a global citizen or a citizen of the world are people who have never lived outside of the UK. They consider themselves a citizen of the world because they, buy organic avocados imported from South America, not because they've actually they like the idea of being a global citizen or a citizen of the world, but actually they are very much citizens of one place. But again, entirely up to other people what they choose to call themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I remember The Guardian once had a long running piece on what is your primary identity. I think they were mainly talking about the context of are you British first, Muslim second, things like
Mm.
that. But there was a man who wrote in saying, my primary identity is that I'm a brown bread eater.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Why not?
Fair enough.
Right. Each to their own. If that's the most important aspect of his identity, who are we to argue? Um, so going back to reverse culture shocks, right? Was there
Mm.
anything else then coming back to the UK? You said it was strange to adjust to not using Turkish in your day-to-day life. Any other things you noticed? Things I don't know about the way people interacted with each other, how they spoke, or well, we kind of did language. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Were there other things?
Yeah, so I think we touched on, the English have the safe language of the weather, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in Turkey, the weather it changes. There's definite seasons, but it doesn't change day to day. What's the weather like? Well, it's like yesterday, and it'll probably be like tomorrow. So the safe topic is really family. And I'm used to going to an office and them asking about who I am, where I'm from, who my parents are. Maybe they know my parents. Oh, why did your family come here? And giving a long explanation of who my family are and where they're from. And I'd get that from school teachers too, right? So if you're in a Turkish university, for example, the first lesson is the lecturer explaining who they are, where they're from, kind of giving you their CV and their credentials.
Okay.
So going to the UK where the lecturer just walks in and says, right, today we're studying this, it did seem quite strange. I'm like, well, who are you? Who are you? I'm
Yeah.
about to
Well, why
listen
should
to
I
you for an
listen to you?
hour.
I don't know who you are.
Exactly. You're going to talk to me for an hour. I have no clue who you are or who your sisters are or anything.
Who's your cousin? Does your mum know my mum? I know this is strange. What's going on
Exactly.
here?
So there are things like that. And again, just even going to an office, I'm used to going to a Turkish office and getting tea and chatting about the world and then getting what I need. And if they don't like me, they'll say, well, this is the rule. And that's their way of blocking anything from happening because the rules are, it's so arcane. Bureaucracy in
Yeah.
the Gulf, it's extraordinary.
Quite
Uh,
literally Byzantine.
exactly. It's where the word comes from and the bureaucracy
Yeah.
is still like that. So yeah, and then going to the UK, I would ask a question and they say, well, the rule is this. And they're trying to help me, but it just raised my hackles like
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. You thought they were being sticky, and you thought, oh, come on, yeah.
But I could see they seemed nice, but they were telling me about the rules, and I was like, it just didn't compute.
Yeah, actually, in China, there's a similar sort of thing. So, There are, as you can imagine, a lot of rules here. China is also a very bureaucratic place. And perhaps this is similar to how it is in Turkey. There is a lot of, what would you call it? The person who you're dealing with, the person you're sat in front of whenever you're trying to get something done, actually has a lot of discretion about how they can apply those rules, right? So it's kind of the opposite of in the UK, where British people almost sometimes kind of fetishize rules, you know what I mean? And they absolutely cannot deviate from a rule, even when it would be extremely easy for them to do so. There would be no negative repercussions. It wouldn't, break any actual laws or anything like that. They'll nevertheless stick to the letter of the law exactly. Whereas in China, it's just a kind of feature of Chinese bureaucracy that there is a lot of flexibility, and the person that you're dealing with has a lot of discretion. And that's something that once you get used to that as a British person coming to China, it actually makes you realize that things can be done a lot quicker and a lot less complex. Because when you sort of see it on paper or you hear about the procedure, you're like, oh man, this is going to take me forever. And how am I going to do this? Because in the UK, we would actually have to do every single one of these things, and we'd actually have to meet every single one of these requirements. And then when you get to China, you kind of realize that, well, if the person's in a good mood and I talk nicely to them and I'm polite and I explain my situation and how important it is, they'll be able to move things around more quickly for me. We won't have to do X, Y, and Z. So, that's something that a lot of British people probably don't realize, is that our sort of commitment, almost turning a virtue into a vice with the British commitment to rules and how things are done, is quite British specific. Even elsewhere in Europe, it's not so much of a thing.
Yes, I'd agree.
So moving on then, you, after 4 years in the UK, during which time, of course, you didn't have to make any effort to enjoy, let's say, or experience British culture because it was just part of your life. You then moved to the Middle East, and in particular you went to a very conservative area of the most conservative country in the Middle East, if not the world, and a country which actually explicitly bans many British cultural activities because they also have religious significance, right? So for example, public celebrations of Easter and Christmas and so on. So what I'm wondering is, during that period then, did you have to try to intentionally keep these aspects of British culture alive? Did you try doing that, or did you just accept, well, for a year I'm just not going to engage in British cultural activities, or what?
So my first thing when I arrived was to try and find anybody else who spoke English, because of my unusual situation. As I say, I was in all Arab housing, all Arab company. Obviously, the people I was teaching didn't speak English because I was teaching them English. But the first, I think it took me about 2 weeks to find another expat, because a lot of people there work with big engineering companies, oil companies, and they're on compounds, which you can't just wander into.
They're like gated communities, right?
Yes, exactly. And some of them are extraordinary in terms of the security going in. So as I say, I couldn't just casually wander in and say, hello, I'm a fellow Brit. So I was able to break in eventually through friends of friends of friends and things like
that. I know what you mean, yeah.
Well, I was able to break into that close circle of friends. And there, as I say, for those, it was a surreal experience, because for those on the compounds, they found it difficult to interact with the locals, right? Because the locals are equally resistant to their culture and talking to them. For me, I was desperately trying to get into a compound from time to time just to speak English and have a friend to talk to.
Do some British type things, That's interesting. It's also a kind of another demonstration of how, is it possible for one man to have a culture? Being as culture is so much of a communal activity, right? When you were one man by yourself, you had to try very, very hard to find another community of people to share this kind of culture with, because how could you do it by yourself, right?
Exactly. And of course, once I was in Oman, I was with my parents, and there's a very limited, I say that in Muscat, the main capital city, there is a bit of an expat community, I think, but where we were in Salalah, which is right on the border of Yemen, well, I met the other expats. We sat around a table once.
Oh, here's a question. When you were in Saudi Arabia, did you celebrate Christmas? Did you happen to be there during that time?
I cannot incriminate myself. And I cannot incriminate others.
Right.
So if I did celebrate it, it must have been by myself. I think I must have had family calls, but again, it's a very surreal experience there.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
as it
I suppose all you can really do is watch a Christmas film on your computer or something like that. Yeah.
exactly, and as I said, for me, Christmas is such a family occasion, so it was family calls.
Yeah, Christmas has always been an interesting one in China because Christmas is not unknown in China, but I think it would surprise some of your listeners who've never been to this part of the world just how um, unimportant Christmas is. You know,
Mm,
even in the big cities. Like, yeah, okay, if you go to sort of Nanjing Road on Shanghai, the shops will have Christmas decorations and stuff. Okay, but Nanjing Road is we're talking of one road on
mm,
the most international city in the mainland, right? It's
yeah,
not representative of the entire country at all, and it's not even representative of the whole of Shanghai. Um, so yeah, really, just how unimportant Christmas is,
mm.
and to the
And
extent Christmas is
the Chinese
celebrated.
people I know would just kind of dismiss it as, oh, it's Western Chinese New Year.
Yeah, exactly right. To the extent that to the extent that it's celebrated by local Chinese people who aren't perhaps Christians, who might celebrate it in a church. I suppose the only way of describing it is by giving some examples. So yeah, the first thing is that's an interesting one. Most of the Chinese people I've met, certainly almost all of my students, and I've taught, over the years, I mean, I used to work in a high school where each one of my classes had about 55 to 60 students, and I had, 12 classes, so you can imagine how
Mm,
many students over my 9 years I've taught. Every one of my students that I've ever met, um, until I tell them otherwise, they believe that Christmas is a New Year celebration, and they often
mm.
say it's the Western version of Chinese New Year. And it's actually quite funny because every class I would do this, and it would always be the same. It would never fail. It would always work. I would say, "Okay, hands up, guys. Does anybody know why do we celebrate Christmas?" And somebody might put their hand up there. Oh, it's a New Year celebration. I'd say, okay, right. So in Western countries, using the Western calendar, when is the New Year? And these are smart kids, right? They're not stupid. So they were like 31st of December, right? So okay, when is Christmas? And they would go 25th. Oh. And it would suddenly dawn upon them that this New Year celebration takes place days before the New Year. And then of course we would go into the actual reason why it's celebrated and stuff. But yeah, so it's just not a feature of Chinese life whatsoever. And by the way, I'm not trying to claim that it should be. I'm not making some sort of statement that, oh, China's so bad for not celebrating Christmas. No, I don't expect Christmas to be a part of Chinese life any more than I expect Chinese, Dragon Boat Day to be a part of British life. I'm just sort of commenting on the reality of the situation,
Yeah.
which some people might not be aware about, which is just how uncommon it is here. And to the extent that it is celebrated, it's celebrated in a way that is so, let's say, untraditional that it's almost not. It's almost would be better if it wasn't celebrated. I mean, because a lot of people think it's a New Year celebration, it's often celebrated like a New Year. So many of my
Mm,
Chinese friends who will try and celebrate Christmas, they will often go to bars and have like a New Year party. One of my friends was telling me his first Christmas in China, his Chinese friends took him to a nightclub. And then when on the 24th of December, when it was close to midnight, they had a countdown like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then when it became the 25th of December, they were like, yay, as if they were
mm.
celebrating the new year.
One of
Um,
my friends living in China got very upset because she left her phone on the 24th, and her phone just blew up at midnight as all very well-meaning Chinese people were sending a message after message saying Happy Christmas.
yeah,
It's,
yeah,
and her
exactly.
friends
So
have been very well-meaning, staying up till midnight, especially so they can
yeah.
message her.
Oh, yeah, certainly. And I mean, as I said, it's not.
Mm,
There's nothing bad about it, right? I mean, if I can, I'm sure that if any British people tried to celebrate Chinese New Year, they would almost certainly make a hash of it as well,
I
and,
can
and
remember my
completely.
own mistake celebrating Chinese New Year, giving someone I knew a red packet, and she was like, "These are for children. I am not a child."
Well, also she was a quite she had a lot of integrity because she could have just as easily taken the money and been like, "Oh, thanks, Tom," you know. Um,
Very
so
good.
yeah, of course, this happens right when cultural activities are taken to other places, and also I actually thought about this quite a lot. Christmas doesn't belong to one culture, right?
Mm,
Christmas is not a British celebration. It's not an American celebration. It's not even a European or a Western celebration, right? It's a global holiday. It's one of the only true global holidays, and Christmas is celebrated differently in different countries. If you go to even within European countries, right, which are culturally very similar, the way Christmas is celebrated in Spain is quite different from how it's celebrated in the UK. And certainly, if you went, say, the way Christmas is celebrated in Canada or the US to how Christmas is celebrated in Lebanon, for example, right, or in Nigeria, these are extremely different ways of celebrating. So I actually think there's no problem whatsoever with Chinese people developing their own Christmas celebrations. If they want to celebrate it, at midnight and so on and so forth, and that's what Chinese people enjoy, great. That's, like I said, it doesn't belong to any one culture. It's a global holiday. But as a British person who's grown up with a certain idea of how Christmas should be celebrated, to then come to this environment where you want to recreate that, and you find many of your Chinese friends are receptive to the idea of celebrating. But then, they're like, okay, well, we'll organize something. And then what is organized is something which is just completely different to what you'd expect. It doesn't really hit the spot. Let's say that, right? It's a bit like you're really hungry and you really want a nice, juicy bacon sandwich, but the only thing you've got is a banana, right? Like bananas, it's fine. Banana's good food. It's healthy, nutritious. It's tasty, but it's not what you want, is it?
Yeah. And it's interesting, as you say, Christmas didn't originate in the UK. If anything, it's really from the Eastern Mediterranean. But it was funny when we were celebrating in the Eastern Mediterranean. A lot of us British people sometimes felt it didn't quite feel right because we've got in our head, the Victorian postcards of snow and sledges and all that kind of thing, which is totally our own creation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Europeans, perhaps the British in particular, and then the Americans via the globalization of American culture, have created perhaps the most popular modern way to celebrate Christmas, right? And that's why it's rooted in that sort of Northern European wintry kind of thing that we have in our imagination. But yeah, of course, Australians, for example, right? I've got Australian friends. Their Christmas is in the middle of summer, and they say that their typical Christmas dinner is a barbecue and possibly going to the beach, which seems crazy to me.
And for all the tolerance that obviously I have for traveling around and experience so many different cultures, and this is especially for Australian listeners, I remember hearing that barbecue is what they'll do at Christmas, and I just thought, well, that's wrong. I thought, each to their own, but you were wrong.
You're going to be on the naughty list next year. You can't have a barbecue at Christmas.
If I have anything to do with that, absolutely yes.
So, when you were in the Middle East, you basically sort of detached yourself involuntarily, perhaps, from any experiences of British culture.
In a way, yes, but also I had to answer a lot, right? So one thing when you're in the UK is that nobody asks you what is Britishness or why do British people do this, why do British people do that. Anywhere you live abroad, suddenly you are the expert on any conceivable aspect. Like, why do people hate this football? Well, I don't follow football, so I don't know. That's not a very satisfactory answer. So suddenly I'm having to research. And I've been bombarded, as I say, ever since leaving the UK, I feel I've been bombarded with questions about British culture. And I've had to really school myself on this. I went abroad to study other cultures, and I've just ended up having to learn all about my own.
That's really, really interesting because I've had a similar experience, right? And this is something I actually wanted to touch on. So I became interested in culture, broadly speaking, in my early 20s. I worked in an international boarding school, and I had the chance to meet people from all over the world, from places I'd sometimes never heard of. I mean, I wasn't an idiot. I had a pretty good understanding of geography, but nevertheless, places as a 20-year-old that I wasn't familiar with at all, right? And it was really, to use a cliche, it broadened my horizons, and that sort of sparked an interest in world culture. And I spent a lot of my time in my early and mid 20s trying to learn about other cultures, both firsthand by traveling a lot, traveling as well. I would intentionally travel to places I was less familiar with, because I felt that I would get more benefit by going to, less, let's say, less well-known, the less beaten path places, than if I just went to places that, everybody already knew about and I could readily find information. And then later, of course, as well, in the UK, via just sort of learning about things online and watching documentaries. And I found it, it wasn't a means to an end. It was an end in itself. I just found it very, very enjoyable, right? I really liked learning about other cultures and how people do things in other countries, and, differences in the way people, perceive things, and so on and so forth. But at that time, I never really thought of learning more about my own culture, right? Which is kind of funny, because of course I had the best opportunity to do that. And just because you grow up and you live in a culture, by no means does that make you an expert on that culture. In some ways, in fact, it can, you almost sort of can't see the wood for the trees, because you're so far in the culture that you can't understand it, right? Or you don't have the broad picture and so on. So yeah, I came to China, and I certainly never came to China with the idea that this would give me a chance to learn about British culture, nor did I ever think that I would sort of become a point of information for many people, from which they can learn about British culture. So it's kind of happened organically, but it's been extremely rewarding in a way that I never could have really imagined that I would take such a great interest in my culture. And just as meeting people in that international boarding school broadened my horizons, I very much feel like being an expat likewise has broadened my horizons about British culture. It's made me question things that I assumed, things that I thought to be true based on my own experiences. It's made me learn a lot more about British history, about how things are, done differently in the UK, in different places, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I found it really rewarding. And I honestly don't think this could have ever possibly happened if I wasn't an expat. I just can't imagine that I would be sitting one day in the UK and decide I want to open a book about British history, or why is it that, we celebrate something this way, or why is it that we talk about this? And yeah, I wonder, is that something similar for you? Like, do you think that, you now make a podcast about British culture, right? Could you ever imagine that would have happened if you had spent, all or the majority of your life in the UK?
I don't think so. And I think we really understand culture, in conflict with the other, right? Like me hearing the Australians have a barbecue at Christmas, and I think that's wrong.
Yeah.
I saw it with a friend from New Zealand who said some phrase, "Oh, so and so lives out on the wop wop." And I'm like,
The
what do you mean
what,
the what?
okay.
The wop wop? Okay, I get it. But an American immediately turned around and said, "That's a New Zealand word, and I need to make a list. Tell me some more New Zealand words." And he's like, I don't have a list of New Zealand words, right? For me, they're just words. They're
Yeah.
just words that I use. All my friends use them. Everyone I've ever met, pretty well in my life has met them until I came here, and suddenly you're all picking on random things that I say. There's
Yeah,
that
exactly.
interaction with the other.
Yeah, he wasn't able to sort of realize what were and were not New Zealand words until he actually left New Zealand, right? That's the kind of unique perspective I think that being an expat gives you, because what was it Donald Rumsfeld said when he was talking about
It's the
going to
known
war in Iraq?
knowns.
It's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, right? So it's kind of like it's the unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So when you are living in the UK and you're just experiencing British culture day to day, you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know which
Yeah.
are the uniquely British words and which words are more, part of international English, and you don't know which things are, the unique ways of behaving in not just the UK, but perhaps the unique ways of behaving in your part of the UK, right? They're
Yeah.
unknown unknowns. And then when you become an expat, and of course this isn't automatic. I mean, you have to take an interest and you have to do some research and stuff. But by being an expat, it turns those unknown unknowns into known unknowns or unknown knowns. I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm messing the metaphor.
It puts it up the scale somewhere.
Yeah, it allows you. It gives you that perspective. You still have that insider's perspective because you grew up in it and you understand it, but you also have the outsider's perspective, and you can look in and find the interesting stuff. And yeah, it's been very rewarding for me. Certainly something, I assumed, of course, I'd learn about Chinese culture by coming to China. I never assumed that I would learn so much more about my own culture by coming to China, and that's been a really interesting experience.
And now I'm having to learn about a whole new one and discover strange aspects of my old one.
Yeah. In fact, do you think, and this is maybe a difficult question for you to answer because you've spent most of your time outside the UK, but are there ways in which being an expat has changed your perspective of aspects of British culture? Specific aspects, sort of things that you thought maybe were ordinary and realized they weren't. I'll give you an example actually of one for me. This comes from, no, I wasn't an expat at the time, or at least not by my definition anyway. It was more sort of studying, working, holiday. But nevertheless, it was a reasonable amount of time spent living outside the UK, which was when I went to Barcelona. I was studying Spanish and working a bit. And back then, this will show my age to some of your listeners, but believe it or not, there was a time before people had camera phones and before everyone had digital cameras. And during that crazy dark age, most of us used cameras that had just little film cartridges, right? And or disposable cameras. So I had a disposable camera, or a couple of disposable cameras, which I brought with me. And I'd gone through one of them and I wanted to get the photos developed. Now, in the UK at the time, there were obviously specific shops, like photo shops, where you could get your photos developed. But the big pharmacies, such as Boots and these other pharmacies, had photo developing facilities. So the vast majority of people who weren't like professional photographers or amateur hobbyists would just take their films to get them developed in the local pharmacy. And I remember being with some friends in Barcelona. They weren't local. They weren't from Barcelona, but they were from elsewhere in Europe. And I said to them, "Oh, is there a pharmacy around here?" And they were like, "Yeah, I think there's one like down the road, blah, blah, blah." And they asked me, "Oh, why do you need the pharmacy?" Like they're concerned, perhaps I'm sick. And I said, "Oh, I want to get my photos developed." And they looked at me like in a really odd way. They're like, "So why do you need the pharmacy?" And I said, "Well, because I want to get my photos developed." And then I thought about it and it dawned upon me, it's so odd. Why would a pharmacy develop photos? A pharmacy dispenses medicine, right? They don't develop photos. And of course, for these people, they also found it extremely unusual that I would assume, or I would think that a pharmacy developed photos, but it's because I come from a country where pharmacies did develop photos, right? And it wasn't until I went to another country when I realized actually how odd that is. A pharmacy whose job is supposed to be to dispense medicine and perhaps sell other health-related products actually is the main place where normal people go to get their holiday photos developed, right? So that's, not a particularly sort of monumentous or life-changing realization, but nevertheless, it was a perspective of mine that changed because I was outside the UK. It gave me a chance to see that actually, something like that, pharmacies developing photos, was actually odd and was the exception, not the rule. But in the UK, it was the rule,
Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything specific. I mean, there's, for me, tiny little things. I know a lot of my friends who are not from the UK have traveled to the UK, have got upset over our currency, that our coins do not go in the size of value.
Ah, yes. Okay,
that
yeah.
upsets so many of my friends.
Yeah.
And then there's the two taps. Most British people have one hot tap and one cold tap. Not a pixie tap, and that upsets. But,
yeah, they always say you have to burn your one hand and then freeze the other, right? And hopefully that balances out.
Exactly.
Was there anything for you in particular, perhaps after leaving Bradford? Again, I think because you've spent so long outside the UK, maybe it's hard for you to think of things.
It is hard. I'm defaulting to a funny story from a friend of mine who's from Syria, and she was traveling on a National Express bus and saw that there were plugs for charging her phone.
Okay.
And she was really impressed because she always knew growing up, Syria's a developing country, blah, blah, blah. So there's no plugs on buses, something like that. So she tries it, but it doesn't work. And she's just thinking, oh my goodness, maybe I'm doing something wrong, maybe whatever. She goes up to the bus driver and says, my plug doesn't work. And he says, oh no, none of them work. And so she said, this is the difference. A developing country doesn't have the plugs. A developed country has them, and they don't work.
They don't work, right? Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
For me, a lot of things when I see them in the UK, I'm like, oh, so we have this, but it doesn't work. That means we're a first world country.
Right. Yeah, I suppose. And I think perhaps more broadly, rather than specific things like the example that I gave, and this might be easier for you to relate to, is because I've spoken to other expats and they've all said similar things. Being outside the UK, particularly if you live, say, like you did in places like Turkey, Cyprus, the Middle East, like I have in China, you have, of course, in China as well, it gives you an understanding of just how rare many of the things that we take for granted in the UK are. and how actually the UK is part of a small group of countries which are exceptional, and they are not part of the majority of countries which are the rule,
Yeah.
And although I don't think that means people can't have a bit of a whine and a moan, and of course British people are very good at having a whine and a moan, nevertheless, again, like we talked about being in the inside and being in the outside, I really think it's very hard to understand until you've experienced life in other countries just how many of the things that we take for granted are actually truly exceptional and don't exist in other countries. And I'm not talking here just about things like, the ready availability of certain technology and stuff, but even things like, the fact that you can rely, for example, upon the police and the justice system. If there is a crime committed against you in the UK, you can be pretty certain that if you phone up the police, they're going to investigate the crime more or less without fear or favor, and they'll do the best to catch the criminal that committed the crime against you. I mean, the reality is in the most countries in the world, that isn't the case. You may have to grease some palms in order to get the police to even open a case. And if the person who committed the crime against you happens to be more wealthy and more connected, well, then that person is probably not going to be, investigated, right? In fact, it could even cause you problems by the fact that you reported it, and these kinds of things, like, of course, we completely take that for granted in the UK, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not, that should be the case. I'm not arguing that it should be the other way around, right? It should be like it is in the UK, but the reality is in most countries, it's not, experiencing what it's like to live in other countries and talking to local people does help you to realize that living in a country like the UK, where we largely have the rule of law, a largely uncorrupt justice system, an ability to influence the people who make our laws, more or less the freedom to sort of live your life as you choose, right? All of these kinds of things are exceptional. And in most countries in the world, that sort of thing doesn't happen, right? And yeah, I think experiencing that on a sort of, a personal level, actually living like in a place, for example, like you lived in Saudi Arabia or other places, it gives you perspective and does help you to be grateful for what we have in the UK. And I think that, gratitude, I think, is a good thing, right? Gratitude is a virtue. I'm not suggesting that it means that nobody should ever complain or that we should never try to improve things. But, remembering to be grateful for what you already have and what has already been created for you by your forebears, I think is a good thing,
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's, again, I see England from a distance as a very free country, but also a well-regulated freedom, if that makes sense, that people have their responsibility to each other and exercise it very well, right, for the most part,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, things like that, right? The fact that the country is quite clean. I mean, I don't think many people realize how other countries, huge amounts of litter in the street is the norm in a lot of places. Right? I think people don't sort of realize, and the reason the UK is so clean is not because we have an army of cleaners. It's largely because of the sort of social norms that we've developed about not throwing rubbish and stuff, and those kinds of social norms are different in other places, right?
Yeah.
So things like that, which we take for granted,
Absolutely. I'd say the UK is, I don't know, I say perhaps my Albion episode where I talked just for 10 minutes on, England being kind of a dream, or maybe that's because I'm an expat. Maybe that is the ultimate expat produce that I do see.
Yeah, that's something interesting, actually. We have a habit of looking back on things with rose-tinted glasses, right? And it's well known that the more time passes, the less you remember the bad and the more you remember the good, right? Which is why people look back on, say, old relationships with nice nostalgic memories, even though they may have been quite bad relationships and stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, maybe we are both experiencing that. When was the last time you went back to the UK?
Probably 3 years ago, maybe more.
Yeah, so for me it was 5 years ago now. Right?
Gosh.
So
But,
I mean, I'm still in regular contact, of course, with my family, and I read British news and stuff. But yeah, it may well be that we have a little bit of rose-tinted glasses going on.
But I can tell you, a few years ago, I went to a small English town that I remember as a child going down. And as a child, my memory was, a very beautiful priory church, a very clean street, and lots of flags, like English flags and Union flags. And just a nice atmosphere, people walking along. And that's obviously a childhood memory. And, you know, I kind of start to think, well, maybe this isn't quite how it was. Maybe there are problems I didn't see as a child and all that kind of thing. But I went back as an adult not long ago, and I walked down the street and it was exactly as I remembered it.
That's really interesting. It's both nice and interesting, right? It's nice that it is
mm,
how you remember it, but also interesting that it's continued, right? It's continued to be
yeah,
that town, right? And I mean that's I think part of again that's a kind of British cultural character trait that we like to conserve and preserve what we preserve our physical heritage, right? And again, that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize when they go, particularly outside of Western Europe, outside of
mm,
the UK, outside of Western Europe specifically, is that actually many cultures around the world don't have that same connection to the built environment, right?
yeah,
I mean, I've always thought that like anybody who thinks they're going to come to China and be surrounded by their image of Chinese architecture would be extremely disappointed because it simply doesn't exist in any meaningful way anymore. I mean,
yeah.
it's not to say there aren't individual traditional buildings, but the reality is it's very few and very far between. And, 99.9% of what you're going to see is going to be big tower blocks and sort of concrete jungle type stuff.
Absolutely. So yeah, that difference between what we imagine and what we see. So it was a rare chance, I say, walking down this English street, and it was not, not only what I remember, but I think what a lot of people would imagine the UK is like. It's not all like that, is it? I mean, with London and big cities across the UK, like Bradford, doesn't match many people's traditional idea of Britain. But it's interesting, you can find it.
Yeah, you can still find it. Yeah. So now this is sort of your current phase of your expat journey. Is you've moved from China after 5 years, right? 6 years, and
Hmm.
now to California. So with everything you've learned about being an expat for so long, do you have any plans going forward about introducing local people to some aspects of British culture, or trying to recreate, or continue to partake in British cultural activities when you're in California?
I can tell you one of the first things we got when we came here was a jar of Marmite. I
Okay,
can tell you that somebody's given me a beautiful, beautiful teapot.
that's nice.
Um, and actually, it's kind of a lot of Americans here saying, "Hey, there's an English pub. You should go and tell us whether it's accurate or not. And hey, there's an English
Okay.
restaurant. We want you tell us whether it's real, right?" So
Yeah.
I've been well looked after here. So in many ways, I just feel I have to live up to the expectations and make sure I'm a good enough English expert for them.
See, I wonder if, because there are obviously so many cultural similarities between the US and the UK, I wonder if in a way that's actually going to make it harder for you to preserve your British culture because it will
Mm,
be so easy to integrate, right? I mean, when you're in China,
yeah,
the culture is so different. You're almost sort of compelled to work on and preserve your own culture, right? Whereas you can almost fall into American culture. You speak the language, you understand much of the pop culture, the history, etc., right?
yes, yeah. So there is that interesting. It's kind of too easy. So you
Yeah,
can
it's
lose
almost too
yourself.
easy. You might actually have to work harder in a sense, to preserve some of the British cultural activities and some of the British sort of, expressions of culture.
Very, very possible. I have to let's get a cricket bat and take it up
Yeah,
again.
yeah. Get a cricket bat and every morning full English breakfast and so on and so forth.
Oh, way ahead of you. Already at
That's
it.
actually. Is it easy to come by all of the ingredients? The one thing I think might be difficult is in the US, bacon is different, right? They
Yeah,
use belly pork to make bacon, and we use back bacon, don't we?
that's right. I mean, having lived in Muslim countries, I'm kind of used to
I
that's the one
suppose no
ingredient I've
bacon.
gone
Yeah,
without. Black pudding, I'd love to have because I just found a really good supplier in China of black pudding, blood sausage.
yeah, black
So
pudding.
yeah,
I'm thinking because you're quite close, you're quite far south in California, right?
yeah, I'm right on the border of Mexico.
So, and this is going to be a bit of a display of my ignorance of Mexican culture, but I know in Spain, and of course, Spain was the colonial power in Mexico for a very long time. In Spain, they do have a tradition of blood sausage. It's different from our blood sausage, as in British blood sausage, but maybe there is a sort of Mexican version which you could get hold of.
And again, that's kind of really interesting, the interaction. You try and create your own culture. But I know I once made an English breakfast to my mind in China, took a picture, put it on Chinese social media. And when I went into work, one of my English friends there was really upset because I put chopped onion on it, which is quite
Ah,
common in
okay, yeah.
Turkish culture, to eat
Right, yeah, but
onion. And she's like, "You're teaching the Chinese that onion goes on an English breakfast."
what's wrong with you? You're racist.
Absolutely.
Uh,
She was appalled.
Yeah, well, but I mean, these kind of things do happen. Actually, hash browns. Hash browns are the most recent addition to a full English breakfast, and they're actually American. So, Brits discovered hash browns via American cuisine, and then we started to include them in our full English breakfast, and now we consider them, of course, an important part of full English breakfast, right? So, it's kind of the nature, I suppose, of food culture and how it changes. So you might start something, right, by having a full English breakfast with streaky bacon, belly bacon, and Mexican sausages. That could be a thing. You might be a pioneer.
Look forward to it. Do
Yeah.
a special podcast all about it.
Right. Well, on that happy note,
On that
should we
bombshell.
draw it to a close?
Yes. Very well. Thank you very, very much for joining me all the way from Fuzhou. It's been really great to talk again.
Yeah, it was great to have a chat. It was really, really interesting. Even though you and I are friends, I feel like I've learned more about your past and your history, and it's a very interesting experience being an expat. So hopefully we've been able to convey a bit of that to the listeners, and our experiences may there's similarities in them, but of course they are unique to us. So I'm sure there are other expats who perhaps have had very different experiences to us, and they might be able to share something interesting about their history and so on.
Yes, yes. So if anyone is a British expat and wants to get in touch with me, then you can find me on Instagram at Fleming Never Dies.
All right, have a great evening, I suppose, or good night, I guess, where you are.
Good night, and thanks for the time difference. Have a good morning tomorrow.
Thanks very much. Bye bye.
See ya. Bye.